Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, April the 9th, 2025. Once again, the headlines are dominated by a certain Donald J. Trump. This time, all the headlines are about his aggressive tariffs on China. China is not folding, has raised the stakes, raising their tariff on U.S. goods to 84%. I'm not entirely sure what gets imported from the United States into China. Maybe crazy ideas. My guest today has done a lot of thinking about America. He has a new piece out in Jacobin magazine. It's called This is America. Daniel Bessner has been on the show before. Actually, he was on last year talking about an excellent piece he had in Harper's Magazine, The Life and Death of Hollywood. His day job is as an academic, an expert on international affairs, and he had an interesting earlier today. He asked, what would Hegel say about Trump? So Daniel, talking to us from Seattle, is on his way to Pittsburgh. I'm not sure what Hegel would say about Pittsburgh, but what would he say about Donald Trump, do you think, Daniel?
History at Hardee's? I don't know. You have to come up with an alliteration. But yeah, I don't know. But the joke being that Trump is wound up being a more important figure than I think people would have imagined given the first term. That the move on tariffs is genuinely new, even different from the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is much different context in a world in which the United States is embedded in international capital flows and international trade exchanges in a way that is just more expansive and extensive than it was in 1930. So Trump is really changing things, at least to some degree. I'm not in the camp of neoliberalism is dead, but I think that something is changing with him. And so that's what sparked that tweet.
We've done lots of shows on neoliberalism. Gary Gerstle, of course, wrote his book about the rise and fall of neoliberalism. You wrote an interesting piece. Again, you write for Jacobin. You are on the left. You're not ashamed or ambiguous about that. You wrote that Trump is dismantling liberal internationalism. Is this something that perhaps, Daniel, from the left should be, if not celebrated, at least addressed thoughtfully, as opposed to simply dismissing everything that Trump does?
Yeah, I mean, it should certainly be addressed thoughtfully. I think that we're obviously in a transitional period, but the interesting thing to me is that it's not like anything we've seen in post-industrial or really industrial modernity, in that basically every country in the world is capitalist. So there's not competing ideological systems. So the thing that I'm thinking about now is imagining the 21st century is actually a less ideological century than the 19th, or really the second half of the 19th and 20th centuries, and what that might mean in terms of international politics. I think that in terms of liberal internationalism or the liberal international order, first thing to say, it was never really true for the global South, and it really wasn't true for Asia, where tens of millions of people died in Cold War era conflicts. But in the North Atlantic world, there was something called the liberal international order. And I think that it is coming apart for a variety of reasons. Just very quickly, I would say it stood on military hegemony, economic hegemony, and cultural hegemony. But the important part to make it liberal international was the cultural hegemony. And I just think, I forget, can we curse on this podcast?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah,
well, you can curse on all podcasts. And of course, I need to remind everyone that you have an excellent podcast, American Prestige, which you present with Derek Davison. You'll have to invite me on, Daniel. Do you allow cursing on your podcast?
We
encourage
necessitate it.
But I'll definitely come on them.
Trump doesn't give a shit about any of that. And I mean, to a certain degree, I think like a lot of Americans no longer care about that form of cultural hegemony, primarily because the material circumstances have degraded since the 1970s and the decline of the military Keynesianism that upheld the Fordist mid-century state. So that I think is coming apart in relation to that article.
Yeah, he throws out some big words, talk about something called cultural hegemony, Daniel. You're clearly a man of the left, maybe reading too much Hegel or Gramsci or something. But You said that you suspected and perhaps even hoped that the 21st century would be less ideological. I'm quoting you than the 19th or 20th century. I'm not sure entirely what you mean by that. Is ideology just a euphemism for neoliberalism or capitalist or
No.
reactionary?
No, no, no. If you think about the 19th and 20th centuries, people really believed in these gigantic world forming and world making almost ideological systems, whether you're talking about liberalism, whether you're talking about fascism, whether you're talking about Bolshevism, socialism, communism. People really lived their lives according to these ideologies, partially because we weren't as alienated and these types of, and there could be social worlds built around these ideologies. You know, you'd wake up in the morning, you'd go to your local socialist meeting, you'd go to work, people would talk about these things, and you'd go to your bowling league, and this was true of various ideologies. And there were basically arguing about how to organize the political economy. I mean, these were the great debates of the 19th and 20th century. How are you going to organize industrial modernity, right? These ideological systems arose basically as a function of that question. And the story of the 20th century is essentially liberal democratic capitalism winning. That's what Fukuyama, I think, he got
Yeah,
half
I was
right
going
and
to bring
half
up
wrong.
Fukuyama because, of
Well,
course, his book, The End of History, was very much premised on your friend Hegel. It was
or Kojeve, I would never know how to pronounce it. Kojeve's reading of Hegel, and people have
Kojeve. So,
with an accent in there.
right. So,
Yeah,
Fukuyama's book was What Would Hegel Say About the Fall of the Berlin Wall?
right. And so Fukuyama was arguing that what the fall of communism meant was that liberalism would triumph. That liberalism was really the only ideology around which one could organize society. And he was not correct about that, but he was correct about what wound up happening was that capitalism totally triumphed. That, in my opinion, at least, China's capitalist, it's state capitalist, Russia's capitalist, it's kleptocratic capitalist, the United States is capitalist, a form of liberal democratic capitalism, although getting a little bit less democratic as time goes on. And so that to me is the new condition of the 21st century. People aren't arguing about different ways of organizing the political economy of industrial or post-industrial modernity. Basically, everyone's just capitalist. And so there's competing capitalisms, and there's different types of capitalisms that are themselves shaped by local cultures. But ideology, nothing's really arisen to challenge liberalism, in my opinion. That people, we could talk about the article. I don't think fascism is actually a thing in the United States. I think that there are long histories to what Trump is doing, even with the tariffs. And so to me, then the big question of the 21st century, what does a genuinely post-ideological world mean? And Daniel Bell also used the phrase end of ideology. He was referring to a mixture of sort of liberal and social democratic elements. When Fukuyama used the term end of history, he was referring to the triumph of liberalism. And I actually think ideology has become less important as we move further and further into the 21st century. So it's a different claim than either Bell or Fukuyama.
So you described the 19th and 20th century as the age of ideology, of fascism versus communism versus liberalism. You've been pretty outspoken, Daniel, that Trump doesn't represent fascism. I strongly agree with you, actually. A year ago for Jacobin, you wrote a piece entitled Liberals' Heated Fascism Rhetoric Sidesteps Self-Reflection. I think that was an important observation. And in this latest piece, This is America, you suggest that what's happening here is anything but fascist. What is it about liberals that encourage them to always bring up the F word? Why are they so obsessed with fascism?
It's actually really clear because the liberal claim to legitimacy and the liberal claim to governance, to being able to govern, was steeped in its defeat of fascism during World War II, to the degree where I would argue, Andrew, I could tell by your accent, I think you're European, that the European political spectrum that was adopted by the United States was only really adopted in the 1940s and into the 1950s, because those types of that political constellation didn't make sense in this country. We had a much different matrix of politics. We had populists, we had conservatives in both parties, we had liberals in both parties. It was a very regional country with regional politics. And it's really only with FDR, and particularly, and FDR actually introduces the term liberalism. My colleague Kevin Schultz found this in the summer of 1932 in order to basically brand the New Deal. He was searching for terms. Liberal and liberalism didn't really have a history in this country. So he thought that it would be a useful way, a new way to describe his politics. And so it's only really with FDR, the New Deal, the defeat of fascism in World War II, that liberalism becomes an generally recognized ideology in this country, and liberals' claim to governance rested on that defeat. So it's not surprising that whenever liberals feel threatened, they turn to fascism, because it's really that original moment that justifies liberal governance. Now, liberals today don't know that. If you you had a ton of liberals on your show. If you ask them that, they would have no idea about that. But it's a deep cultural strand to their own ideology, which is why this fascism rhetoric emerged with Trump. And we could go through why, but Trump is very American. He is very, very different from a Nazi or an Italian fascist, even though all far-right ideologies have family resemblances. Obviously, that's not a particularly useful way to understand Trump.
We've done a lot of shows about reaction in 20th century America. Adam Hochschild's book, American Midnight, I'm sure you're familiar. Done a couple of shows with him. It's a bestseller, The Great War, A Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. And then a couple of weeks ago, did another show with the New York Times journalist, writer Clay Risen. He has a new book out, Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Is what Trump is doing, and you write about this in This Is America, Daniel, is it basically much different from the Palmer raids after World War I or the McCarthyite hysteria after World War II?
Not in terms of his deportations or his relationship to political radicalism, or immigrants. That obviously has an incredibly deep history in the United States, from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan to the 1924 Immigration Act, to, like you said, the Palmer raids, which were based on these World War I laws that were passed by Woodrow Wilson in order to quash anti-war dissent. And funnily enough, Columbia was also a center. Back then, the people who were dismissed from Columbia for being anti-war were actually the people who founded the New School for Social Research.
Yeah, and Adam does a wonderful job describing the deportation of Emma Goldman in that period.
Yeah, and Alexander Berkman, I believe. And so, yeah, there was definitely antecedents. And then you go to the early 1950s, you go to the Immigration and Nationality Act, you go to the Internal Security Act, you go to the Alien Registration Act, which I believe was a 1940 act. So yeah, those all have deep antecedents. The extent of the tariffs is new. That is the real new thing that Trump is doing.
Well, doesn't the terrorist stuff come logically out of paranoia about the outside world, a kind of isolationism? But before we get there,
sure,
Daniel, what is it about America that has prided itself, maybe fairly or not, on being an immigrant society, an open society, Statue of Liberty, and all the rest of it?
Well, that's a very Cold War thing.
But it was an immigrant, or it still is in some ways an immigrant society. I mean, there was no one here, at least apart from native peoples, up until the European colonization. What is it about that brings out this hysteria about immigration?
Well, yeah, it's a settler society from the beginning, with Anglo settlers, also quite earlier in German settlers and Irish settlers. And there's waves of immigration over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century, and down till today. And I think that the deep xenophobia, one would almost have to psychologize those who engage in it, but there's probably something about feeling insecure in one's own position in the United States, relatively recent immigration within the last 100 years. There's also the fact that in a capitalist society in which people don't want to redistribute wealth, that there's always going to be a search for a scapegoat, and sort of the lowest hanging fruit is absolutely immigrants and even naturalized residents, because their political position is precarious. To me, it's linked primarily to xenophobia, and it emerges during precarious material times. That's when you get the biggest anti-immigrant sentiment in this country over time, even though there's always this, what the historian Adam Goodman terms the deportation machine, kind of running, regardless of whether people in the media are paying
Yeah, and you
attention
write
to it.
about his
Yeah.
term, the deportation machine, and especially after World War One. Of course, another great historian, Richard Hofstadter, came up with the concept of the paranoid style of American politics. Is that indigenous, Daniel, and does that play a role in Trumpism?
Yeah, when you get into Hofstadter, it's kind of difficult because he's using a lot of mid-century psychoanalytical terms,
Is he a bit
and the
liberal to you, or
psychoanalytical.
do you like him?
He's fine. I mean, like he's good. He was. I mean, I think the Cold War liberals went wrong to a significant degree. I actually have a volume coming out with Cambridge University Press on Cold War liberalism, of which Hofstadter, of course, is a chapter on Hofstadter and how he understood the far right. But he essentially psychologized the far right, and I didn't think he took seriously enough the material sources of what was actually going on with this McCarthyite movement. And another thing to make clear, that McCarthyism was actually really the second half of a Red Scare that was begun by Truman in the late 1940s. And the way that I view it is that Truman really started it and McCarthy finished the job. And McCarthy also kind of, but not totally, there were elements of this in Truman's Red Scare, but really focused on the intellectual and cultural elites, where Truman really focused on the political governing establishment. So there are connections there. But yeah, no, Hofstadter is fine so far as it goes. I wouldn't necessarily embrace the psychoanalytic framework that he really institutionalized, to the degree where a lot of people understand the far right still today through psychologizing mechanisms, as opposed to what I think is more useful, the way to understand them, which is as the result of particular material conditions. Not totally. Racism is still a thing separate from one's material position, but I think material conditions go a long way to explaining politics.
You describe America as a settler society. You're primarily a professor of international politics. You wrote an interesting piece for Jacobin a couple of months ago about the US in Gaza. It was always in the US's power to force a ceasefire. Of course, Israel is a settler society, for better or worse, very much in the news, especially on university campuses. Is there some similarity between Netanyahu and Trump's reassertion of Israel and the United States as settler societies?
Yeah, I mean, in the broad sense, they're both colonial societies, as early Israeli leaders were very conscious of. I mean, Theodore Herzl's emerging from a 19th century European context in which colonization was very much on the order of the day, and his argument was related to what was going on, with the so-called scramble for Africa in the late 19th century and Jews' relationship to colonization. So yeah, I think the United States and Israel are, of course, both settler societies, though I don't think that really helps explain what's going on now necessarily. I think that Trump is just taking his, which everyone has talked about, his normal transactional approach. I think he actually believes, and one thing about Trump is that he kind of just says what he thinks, and what he thinks is also, in this case, correct as so far as it goes. He thinks that Israel is not going to stop pummeling Gaza. He thinks that Israel has essentially won in its fight against Palestine, and that he's just trying to basically get the best deal out of that situation. Whereas someone like Joe Biden might have still been referring to a two-state solution, which anyone who studies this in any real depth thinks that ship sailed decades ago. Trump is just like, yeah, Israel won, and now the United States should try to, build the Trump Tower in Gaza. And so I think that is primarily what explains what's going on. there with the U.S. and Israel today.
So your piece, Daniel, is called "This is America." It's not called "This is not America." You've noted that America isn't fascist because that's the wrong word to describe it, and fascism is mostly a European term. In the piece, you talk about the growth of presidential power in America since 1776, and you argue that the president is increasingly becoming, or has increasingly become, the equivalent of an elected monarch. In terms of the narrative in Trump's America, is that what America is now, a place where the president has become the equivalent of an elected monarch? Is that the most effective way of reading Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the United States, I think it's always clearer in this country. It first happens in foreign policy, because that is an issue area that is generally of less immediate interest to Americans, unless when they're literally fighting wars and being killed, which of course hasn't really happened in mass since the early 1970s when Congress didn't renew the draft. But famously, the United States has not declared war since 1942. The United States has engaged in over 200 have variously defined conflicts since that moment, none of which have really official congressional authorization, at least when it comes to the declaration of war, unless you think of like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution or the authorization to use military force. These are sort of not they're short of war, but they're not official declarations of war, although I think we could say the United States has been at war since then. So there's been a low-level constitutional crisis since 1942. It's just now coming to inform other issue areas, and it actually has informed other issue areas, particularly macroeconomic policy. When was the last time Americans voted on the macroeconomy of their country? The answer is never.
What do you mean by that? Hold on, wait a minute. What do you mean by that?
What should the planning, what should the government fund certain industries? Should the government invest in particular spheres? What should the government actually?
Biden, for better or worse, run in part on that?
Yeah, I would not say that it's a genuinely democratically decided. The Inflation Reduction Act was not a democratically decided thing, basically due to the reality. I mean, I think I'm very shaped by a 2014 paper by, I think, Ben Page and Gillens, I forget his first name, which essentially shows that even if ordinary people are organized in interest groups, they actually can't shape policy, that really only business shapes policy. So I would say that, given the reality of lobbying in the United States, that even a congressional imprimatur doesn't really make it democratic. But that's a bit of a sophisticated argument that moves beyond what Americans like to think about, which is that procedural democracy is democracy. Voting is democracy. Congress doing something is democracy. I have a more expansive definition of it, but that's neither here nor there.
So Daniel,
yeah.
the thing I'm a bit confused. I'd like some clarity from you on. On the one hand, when you read this essay and you talk about the president has increasingly become the equivalent of an elected monarch, there's obviously a straight line between Nixon and Trump. It sounds.
FDR and Trump.
Hold on, let me just finish. It sounds in some ways like just a sort of classic American political scientist noting the growth of American political power. But you're a man of the left, clearly. You're interested in cultural hegemony, economic hegemony, political hegemony. You've written this piece for Jacobin. How does I'm careful not to use the word ideology. How does your worldview connect with the increasingly centralized nature of power in America?
Well, it's not one that I would propose. And I actually think that Nixon isn't the key figure. The key figure is FDR. And I think this is one of the things that many people don't like to talk about, but it's really FDR who made the modern presidency after Woodrow Wilson began some processes. So, for example, do you know how many executive orders FDR issued?
A lot.
3,700.
Yeah, that
which
is a lot.
Orders of, I think it's 3791 if I remember correctly, something around there. It's definitely above 3700. But essentially what that did was that essentially made the president really the center of everything in the United States. And so FDR did it for what I would say were relatively good purposes. I would prefer if he actually instituted a social democratic system instead of having elements of social democracy to save capitalism, which is what the New Deal was. But that was an epochal transformation in American presidential power. And I think just over the course of the second half of the 20th century, a lot of people have studied this. Jeremy Surrey, the historian, for example, wrote a book called The Impossible Presidency. Another scholar named John Gans, Gans, wrote a book called White House Warriors, which shows how power has been increasingly centralized in the executive branch. And so presidential power has grown over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. And in fact, Andrew, if you look back even further in my Jacobin writings, when Bernie was running, I said when Bernie, the first day one, he has to just follow FDR and issue tons of executive orders, because that's really the only way to transform the American state in a genuine way. And that's precisely what Trump is doing. I wonder if Trump read my Jacobin piece. But yeah, no, that's not the world I would prefer to live in.
I somehow doubt it. But coming back to the FDR observation, I think it's an important one. And of course, most people are not willing to acknowledge it because probably most of us, you and I, and most of the viewers and listeners on this show certainly would be sympathetic to what he was doing. So is Trump then a natural, almost perhaps an inevitable outgrowth of FDR?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the American...
You've given me my title for the show. Go on.
So the American state, to my mind, has become less and less democratic in its modern form. Since, if you think like the American state in its modern form is really shaped in the 1930s, over the course of the 20th and into the 21st centuries, it's become less and less democratic in the sense that ordinary people have less and less influence over things, that they can't organize really. How many people protested against the Iraq war? That didn't matter a fucking bit. How many people wanted the global war on terror to end earlier? How many people would want some form of economic redistribution or Medicare for all or higher taxes on the wealthy? All of these things actually poll quite popularly last time I checked, and they have absolutely no influence on the American state. And that's because the American state has assumed a form that is essentially, in the way that Marx almost kind of warned about, is now so ordinary people are so alienated from the state that it almost functions independently of any human will. Not totally, as Trump is demonstrating, right? The president does have power. I don't know if you remember this, Andrew, but like in 2014, I think it was Ezra Klein wrote about the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, that it's totally ridiculous to think that the president can do things. He was just totally wrong. If anyone knows anything about the structure of the American state, that's not true. And Trump is demonstrating that right now. He could basically do unilateral tariffs that are going to totally disrupt global trade, the lives of Americans, the lives of people abroad, and there's no one to stop him. And we could get into how George W. Bush affected that, but yes, I think Trump is a natural outgrowth of a presidential system in which the president is increasingly powerful, because sometimes you don't get the president you want. And this is something that people like John Yoo, who really trumpeted the theory of the unitary executive, should have thought about before they were advocating that philosophy.
I'm still trying to position you, Daniel. Are you in the Thomas Frank populist left school? Is that where you're coming from here? I assume you don't approve of the growth of presidential power, that you see alternatives, that it's not inevitable, that all American politics doesn't have to be associated around an elected monarch. So what are you actually arguing in this book should be the case? I mean, you're clearly...
What's my normative vision?
Yeah.
Basically, there needs to be created democratic mechanisms for ordinary people at the local and regional level to actually shape national policy and politics. What those democratic institutions are, I think we're at the stage of diagnosing the problem. We're not even at the stage of developing a genuine solution. But the first thing, it's never going to happen unless you actually limit the power of organized capital. And nothing in the history of this country the deep history or the recent history suggests that that's going to happen. So without limiting capital.
And this is what I'm struggling when you talk about organized capital. A lot of CEOs are very unhappy with what Trump is doing on the tariff side. A lot of American billionaires are revolting against him. How do you make sense of Trump's economic policy,
Well,
supposedly speaking on behalf of the very people that you seem to be sympathetic to, the outsiders. Is that
yeah,
wrong?
so they got him elected, but I think what this demonstrates is that the president has a significant degree of power, particularly if you're like Trump. You're probably not going to run another term. You're quite old. You don't give a shit. You're pretty pissed off because the liberal jurists came after you were out of office, and so you're just not going to care about what people think. Also, you have to remember it is very early days. We're talking on the first day when the tariffs are really instituted, so we'll see what actually happens over time. But this is where Trump is genuinely new. That he is trying to effectively do some type of reshoring process, which is to some degree attacking international capital flows. The degree to which that will actually change things, I don't know, because I think we're living in a really strange moment where there's still a lot of neoliberal elements to the literal law of the United States that you're allowed to, various financial moves that hedge funds do. I think like wolf packs, that was illegal. Various types of stocks and buybacks and dividends. There were limits on that and previously in history. So those don't exist anymore. So that's a neoliberal political and legal structure. But Trump is doing this type of early 20th century, 19th century tariff move, which I think is going to be very difficult to actually lead to the reshoring of American manufacturing for a variety of reasons. So we're in, again, it's clear that neoliberalism didn't provide the utopian vision that someone like Fukuyama maybe envisioned for it in his End of History essay. But the best we can now return to is 19th century tariffs, because again, no one's really going to attack the capitalist system itself in a redistributive way.
In terms of this reform of the decentralization of power, economic, political, cultural, where do we begin? Political experiments, you're in Seattle. I know there's been some experiments in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, on citizen assemblies. Are these the sorts of institutions, of innovative political initiatives that we need to look at to reform the system?
You'd have to relate it to national policy in a meaningful way, which no one has been able to do. So I genuinely don't know how it's going to work, because the federal government, as we're seeing in my own world of universities, just provides so much money around the country that you're going to have to meaningfully connect whatever local thing you're doing to that. And again, in a government which is largely captured by capitalist interests, I just don't think how that's meaningfully done. I mean, to be honest, Andrew, I think we might have lost, and I think there might be no hope. I joke around that we lost in 1914. Once the working classes of Europe fought each other in a world-ending war, that was pretty much it, because the state has become so complex. Capitalism has become so complex, and there are so many nodes of it, not only in this country but around the world. It's not really, one isn't really able to take over a state like the Bolsheviks were able to take over a state in 1917. The context is so different. So to be honest, I don't think we're going to make any genuine reforms. I think we're not going to address climate change. I think we're not going to address economic inequality. Things are just going to get worse until some type of exogenous shock, whether it's climate, whether it's war, whether it's aliens, forces us to change. I think we've lost this stage of human history, as Marx predicted. I'm sure you've read the manifesto recently, Andrew. In the very first page, I believe, he says either you're going to basically transcend the economic system, or you're going to create a world that contributes to the mutual ruin of the contending classes. And I'm pretty sure we're in the era of mutual ruin. So I don't think there's much hope, to be honest.
Well, we began with Hegel. Let's end with him. You tweeted, what would Hegel say about Trump? In terms of these grand historical theories, you talked about Fukuyama too. I mean, Trump seems to recognize the problems. His solutions probably aren't very wise or civilized. Doge, for example, an attempt to make the US state, more efficient. What do you think, leaving aside Hegel, what do you think historians will eventually say about Trump? That he failed, but he failed in a kind of interesting way?
Well, I think it's clear. First of all, there's not going to be future historians because the historical profession is dying. So whatever rich person
you are
decides to write a
miserable
history,
today. Well, I think you're getting ready to go to Pittsburgh. Yeah, I hope you're not going to be quite as miserable when you go to Pittsburgh. They'll throw you out.
someone once said Someone once said one person's cynicism is another person's realism. So when that fourth son of Elon Musk's grandson or granddaughter decides to write the history of Trump, I think he'll say something along the lines of Trump was a symptom more than a cause. And Trump was a symptom, to my mind, of the failure of liberalism, ultimately. The failure of liberals to, like they had in the past, incorporate criticism in a way that would allow them to engender a stable coalition, as happened with FDR. Obama just didn't do any of that. Obama did not take the financial crisis seriously enough. He didn't really commit himself to economic redistribution. And that just frankly set the stage for Trump. Then when Bernie Sanders was a genuine, a real candidate, Obama seems to have done what he did to prevent Bernie from becoming the president. So we get a basically declining, senescent Joe Biden, who did not instill confidence in anyone, which is another example of the failure of liberalism. And then that led us to an almost unprecedented return of Trump after losing his bid for re-election. So to me, it's really the story of the age is not the rise of Trump or the rise of the far right. It's the failure of liberalism, and that's, I think, what created the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, and I think your point about the senility of Biden is well taken. No hope, finally, Daniel. You mentioned Bernie a little bit. No hope in AOC and a new, younger wave of leftist Democrats?
I think AOC, disappointed with her when it came to Gaza. I think that she's going to have a long road ahead to becoming the type of figure that Bernie was able to become. I think it's unclear to me what AOC's core politics actually are. But then again, we live in a gerontocracy, and God forbid the baby boomers are going to shuffle off the stage soon enough. And that might lead to things that we haven't seen before, but that's very difficult to predict. So maybe, but AOC, I think, has a long way to go.
Well, Daniel Bessner, author of This Is America. I'm not saying it's been a very cheerful conversation, but maybe a necessary one. I hope you're as miserable in Pittsburgh as you are on the show. Make them more miserable about the future of America. Maybe there's some Hegelian dialectic there that the more miserable you make us, the more likely you are to change the world. Daniel, always an honor to have you on the show. You've been on before. We'll get you again. This Trump story, or this final, perhaps, chapter in the history of neoliberalism isn't ending yet. So lots more talk